The war in Korea from 1950 to 1953 was one of the most important conflicts of the 20th century. Following the Second World War, the U.S. defense spending began to decrease, but the conflict in Korea reversed this trend, and U.S. military spending once again skyrocketed. The war in Korea was provided as a propaganda justification for U.S. military spending and military expansion around the world under the guise of fighting against supposed communist aggression. The case of Korea was pointed to justify U.S. policy in this regard. Now, the Korean War is often called the Forgotten War in the U.S., and it's largely unknown. And to the extent that it is known about, most of the coverage of it in the U.S. is completely false. So this will address the misconceptions and falsehoods that are often told about the Korean War. To understand the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, we have to understand the historical context. The way the Korean War is covered in the U.S. and countries friendly with the United States government is that the North invaded the South and that this was an act of quote-unquote communist aggression, and that the United States, with the United Nations, the United States, as part of the United Nations, intervened to save the day to protect quote-unquote democracy in South Korea. If we look at the facts of what actually occurred, we realize that this is nothing more than ridiculous propaganda. Now, most people, I think, at this point in the United States understand that the Vietnam War was an unjust war waged by the U.S. government against the people of Vietnam, and that the lies told at the time of supposed communist aggression by North Vietnam against the supposed democracy, so-called democracy in South Vietnam, were all lies. So why is it that when it comes to the Korean War, much of the lies told, the Cold War era propaganda about the Korean War, is not challenged? In many ways, the Vietnam War was a repeat of the situation in the Korean War, where you had a southern regime that was installed by the United States and a government in the North, which represent the historical struggle of the nation for national liberation and independence, and indeed for socialism. So to understand this in the case of Korea, we really have to go back to shortly before the outbreak of the Korean War. And to set the stage of what led up to the Korean War, we should really start with the Japanese control of Korea, which existed from 1910 to 1945. During this period, Korea was annexed by the Empire of Japan, and this occupation of Korea by Japan was very much opposed by the people of Korea. The Japanese Empire tried to perpetrate the myth that the Korean people were just Japanese, and they tried to erase the culture of the Korean people. They suppressed the Korean culture. The resources of the country were looted. The population was enslaved, and opposition, peaceful opposition, such as protests, were met with gunfire. This atmosphere in Korea at the time led Kim Il-sung to organize resistance in Manchuria, where there was a large Korean population who had fled Korea to escape the tighter control of the Japanese authorities which existed in Korea at the time. So Kim Il-sung was organizing first student resistance against the Japanese occupation. Then, as the situation intensified, he organized the Korean People's Revolutionary Army, which was a guerrilla army which fought against the Japanese occupation of Korea and Manchuria. Now, at the time, Manchuria, as well as Korea, were Japan's most important colonies. And this is something, again, that is not taught in the United States and is not really well known about. Oftentimes, when the Second World War with regards to Japan is discussed, what comes to mind is fighting in Pacific Islands. But the reality is that most of the fighting with Japan in the Second World War and in the 1930s was going on in mainland Asia, in Manchuria, in China. And this fighting had been going on from 1931 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria until eventually the Second Sino-Japanese War, which erupted in the 1930s. And Japan's main, strongest fighting force was the Kwantung Army, which was based in Manchuria, and that was the army that Kim Il-sung was fighting against. Finally, in August of 1945, Kim Il-sung, leading the Korean People's Revolutionary Army, in alliance with the Soviet Red Army and the forces of Socialist Mongolia, liberated Korea, as well as Manchuria, and of course, in alliance with the Chinese revolutionaries. Now, this is very important because one of the myths of U.S. propaganda regarding the Korean War is that Kim Il-sung was just a Soviet puppet. Well, this is absolutely ridiculous because Kim Il-sung was highly regarded by the Korean people as a great revolutionary and a true patriot who was leading the national liberation struggle of his people, of his country. Now, further context to the division of Korea with North and South is that the Soviet forces and the Korean revolutionaries had actually liberated the entirety of the northern half of the Korean peninsula. The Soviet forces actually stopped at the agreed upon parallel and allowed for the United States to move into the south. This was an extremely conciliatory move on the part of the Soviets, actually. The Soviets would have had full ability, actually, to take the entirety of the peninsula and create a socialist government in the entirety of the peninsula, but they didn't. And it was a goodwill gesture on the part of the Soviets and the Korean revolutionaries to allow the U.S. to even move into the southern part of Korea, because the U.S. had no ability to be there at the time. In fact, it took them some time afterwards to finally get into the southern part of the peninsula. Now, the reason why the Soviets did this was because there was an understanding that there would be elections, democratic and fair elections in the country, and that this partition would be short-term. Well, once the United States got into the South, they quickly put an end to any idea that that would happen. There were people's committees that were forming in the South of Korean patriots, Korean socialists, Korean nationalists, Korean communists, of various strands of Korean patriots who were coming together in these people's committees. And the U.S. appointed regime in the South quickly crushed all these democratic forces in the South. In the southern half of the peninsula, the U.S. was installing Syngman Rhee as the dictator of South Korea. Now, South Korea, despite the propaganda, was not a democracy. Far from it. At the time, there were massacres going on in the South against Korean anti-imperialists, Korean patriots, communists, socialists, leftists, progressives, carried out by the U.S.-installed puppet government in the South. And indeed, it was a puppet government. The U.S. handpicked Syngman Rhee and prevented any kind of alternative from coming to power in the South by massacring anyone who was opposed to his rule. And these massacres are well known in South Korea, actually. In the 90s, there was sort of an opening up and reconciliation that was going on, and it's very well known the atrocities, the horrible crimes committed by Syngman Rhee. And Syngman Rhee was not popular at all in the South. It's ridiculous to say that he was some democratic leader, because what ended up happening to him in 1960, he was overthrown by the South Korean people. There was a popular uprising, the April Revolution of 1960, where the people of South Korea rose up and overthrew this US installed dictator. So he was not a good leader at all. He was not popular. He did not represent the will of the people of Korea. So during this period prior to the Korean War, this period in between Japan being kicked out of Korea and the war, the Korean War of 1950 to 1953 breaking out, during this period there was massive repression in the southern half of the peninsula. While this was going on, there was also a massive military buildup on both sides. But on one hand, you had the United States occupying the South and building up this force in the South with Syngman Rhee, who, while himself, he was not, during the period of the Japanese occupation of the country, he was not personally a puppet of the Japanese. In fact, he didn't fight for the country's independence the way Kim Il-sung actually put his life on the line and fought for the country and struggled for the country's independence. Syngman Rhee was over in the United States supposedly petitioning for Korea's independence, which didn't amount to anything. So he was not really known among the Korean people the way Kim Il-sung was known as a hero. So while Syngman Rhee, the ruler in the South, U.S. installed, was not personally a puppet of the Japanese, many of the generals in South Korea were direct Japanese puppets. Some of these South Korean generals that fought for Japan included Chung Il-kwon, Park Sun-yup, Lee Hyung-geun, and probably the most ridiculously, Yoo Jae-hung, who not only fought for Japan, but fought for Japan in the Pacific Campaign against the U.S. Rather ironic, considering the U.S. would take this general who had just been fighting against them and put him as a leader of the South Korean military. The infamous dictator who would come later in the Cold War, Park Chung-hee, not only was a Japanese puppet, served in the Kwantung Army of the Japanese Kwantung Army, which again was Japan's strongest military force stationed in Manchuria during the Second World War. He even changed his name to a Japanese name and renounced his Korean name. So while Syngman Rhee himself was not personally a Japanese puppet, all these other people around him, the generals, people in higher positions, were Japanese puppets who betrayed their country. So there really is no moral equivalency between the government of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the so-called Republic of Korea in the South. In the North, you had Kim Il-sung and the Workers' Party of Korea, which is made up of people who fought for the country's independence. They gave their blood, they gave their lives for the country's independence. So the North was the true patriotic government, while the South was an undemocratic, U.S.-installed regime of corrupt sellouts, basically, who had previously sold out to one power, and now that the U.S. was in, they sold out to the current foreign occupier. So the stage was set before 1950 for hostilities between the government in the North and the South. The idea agreed upon between the Soviet Union and the United States that there would be democratic elections were dashed by the U.S. and its puppet government in the South, with these horrendous massacres going on, and military hostilities began to arise along the border. Now, yet another piece of this history that is ignored in the U.S. is the fact that prior to the full outbreak of war, there were constant clashes between the North and the South. And according to the U.S. historian Bruce Cummings, who is considered the top American historian on Korea, even by the mainstream, he has been to North and South Korea multiple times. He's even won awards by from the South Korean government. He lectures even for the U.S. government. He's even lectured for the CIA, I believe. So he is considered by the establishment of the establishment in the U.S., he's considered the top reputable source, American source on Korea. And according to him, there were clashes going on prior, and before the DPRK, quote unquote, invaded, as we're taught in the US, that the North just invaded in an act of aggression. Before that happened, the South was carrying out attacks into the North, incursions into the North, and there was this ongoing conflict going on. And finally, the DPRK, led by Kim Il-sung, responded, and the Korean People's Army moved in. The outbreak of the war occurred on June 25th of 1950, where the Southern forces made an incursion into the North, and the Korean People's Army pushed them back and kept rolling south. Now, the achievements in this phase of the war in particular are astounding, because this Southern regime, occupation regime, that had been massively backed up by the United States, collapsed. The Korean People's Army swiftly swept into Seoul, the capital of South Korea, despite not only facing against the army of South Korea, but also the U.S. Air Force heavily bombing and attempting to stop the Korean People's Army, but they could not stop the force of the Korean People's Army, which was a highly trained, highly motivated force. And that's a very important factor, is that it was a highly motivated force, unlike the South, which was led by sellouts, traitors to the country. So it's natural that the army of the North, the Korean People's Army, would be much more motivated than the army of the South, and that's why the Southern Army completely collapsed, even with U.S. backing. And the Korean People's Army took 90% of the peninsula. You could see on the map, the Korean People's Army liberated almost the entirety of the southern half of the country, pushed the U.S. and South Korean forces all the way down. Now, at that point, the U.S. panicked, because the rulers of the U.S. thought that the government of the North, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, would just cave to the aggression, and that it would be an easy overthrow for them to overthrow the socialist government in the northern half of the peninsula. But they were wrong. They were shocked by this. The U.S. responded by gathering all of its satellites to invade the North. Not just the U.S., but Britain, Turkey, the NATO countries, and even Japan, actually. Now, at the time, this was kept secret and it was denied, but in fact, Japan participated in the Korean War. Now, that would be massively embarrassing for the U.S. and the Southern government at the time, because to the Korean people, Japan was the enemy. The whole point of establishing a government in Korea was for Korea to be independent. Again, Korea was occupied by Japan from 1910 to 1945. So the whole idea of a Korean government is coming out of the brutal occupation of the country. So it would have been massively embarrassing for that information to be admitted by the United States. But actually, we have now Japanese news outlets which have reported this, because some decades after the Korean War, Japanese veterans who served in the war in Korea at this period were asking for compensation from the Japanese government. So it became difficult for this this embarrassing secret to be kept hidden. But we now know that Japan, in fact, actually also participated. So the United States gathered so many forces to fight against this small country, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, not even controlling the entirety of the peninsula. This small country was able to deal such a blow to the U.S., which had been used to winning all over the world. The United States was touted its army at that time as invincible, as never losing a war up until that point. So the US had to gather all these massive forces and push. And at this point, they also organized partisan movement, which is they organized guerrilla fighters behind enemy lines, and Korean patriots actually took up arms against the U.S. and the other foreign occupying forces that had invaded Korea. Korean people took up arms against them, and with support of China, actually, eventually the Chinese People's Volunteers also intervened in support of Korea, because at the time, this is another fact that's not well known in the United States, the US was actually considering using nuclear weapons against China, actually, and also the Soviet Union, potentially. There was a discussion about this with the US president at the time, in fact, was considering this as a possibility. General MacArthur actually admitted this openly, which that was a little bit too far for the US government. They didn't want to admit it openly, and there was also, because of course there was the danger at this time, the Soviet Union also had nuclear weapons, there's the danger of retaliation. So they obviously ended up not doing that, but there was a major threat against the People's Republic of China, and also the US was talking about continuing past the border with China. So China, with the People's Volunteers Army of China, intervened and helped the Korean People's Army and the Korean guerrilla forces drive back the US into what eventually became the demilitarized zone, which exists today. But during this whole period of the fighting in Korea, the Korean People's Army captured a US general even, and the US was unable to overthrow the government in the DPRK, and this was a major defeat for the US at the time. And the US actually eventually, on July 27th of 1953, signed an armistice agreement with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which the US actually admitted was a defeat. It was the first time in the US military history where the US had not had a victory. The four-star general of the U.S. Army who signed the armistice on July 27, 1953, Mark Clark, stated that, quote, "In carrying out the instructions of my government, I gained the unenviable distinction of being the first United States commander in history to sign an armistice without victory." During the course of the war, the U.S. committed horrendous atrocities, which, again, are not taught in the United States. You know, when it comes to the Vietnam War, there's some coverage of the U.S. atrocities and the atrocities of the U.S. Puppet South Vietnamese government. Even that, they don't really give an honest coverage of, but there's some knowledge of U.S. atrocities in Vietnam. But when it comes to Korea, it's really unknown in the United States, and it's hidden. And one of the examples of the U.S. crimes in Korea was the bombing of Pyongyang. And Pyongyang, the capital of the DPRK, was a major industrial city. It was not just some undeveloped area. It was a major city. U.S. bombing left no building standing higher than one story. The complaint of U.S. bomber pilots at the time was that they would return back to base with their payloads still intact, because they would come back and say there's nothing left to bomb. During the Korean War, the U.S. dropped more bombs on Korea than the U.S. had dropped in the entire Pacific theater of the Second World War. With regard to the extreme bombing of Korea by the United States, U.S. General Curtis LeMay said, quote, "We went over there and fought the war and eventually burned down every town in North Korea anyway, some way or another, and some in South Korea too. Over a period of 3 years or so, we killed off, 20% of the population of Korea as direct casualties of war or from starvation and exposure." Besides the heavy bombing of the country, there were, again, as prior to the outbreak of the war, there were massacres in the southern half of the peninsula. During the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, the U.S. and the Southern puppet regime committed horrendous atrocities, massacres against the people of Korea. Now, there's a lot of propaganda by the U.S. at the time that the North was somehow committing massacres. And there was a particularly terrible example of U.S. propaganda with this propaganda film put out by the U.S. government called Crime of Korea, narrated by Humphrey Bogart, where there's video footage of the aftermath of a massacre with corpses, massive numbers of corpses. And Humphrey Bogart is narrating this, saying that the communists supposedly carried out this massacre. Well, in reality, that particular massacre was carried out by South Korean forces with U.S. troops watching it happen.
And everywhere lay the murdered dead. The scenery of destruction is monotonous. Atrocity stories keep repeating themselves. How can I tell you? What can I show you of the 10,000 human beings slaughtered in Seoul? Perhaps it isn't exactly 10,000. Perhaps the total figure right now is approximate, if that makes any difference. In time, we'll get a careful tabulation. We'll learn the exact number of the slaughtered, down to the last corpse.
Now, this is a complete reversal of black and white, done as a matter of policy. And I was astonished when
This is a known fact because, again, in South Korea, there was a whole Truth and Reconciliation that happened in the 1990s where the truth of these massacres came out. So the people of South Korea are fully aware of this. But in the United States, this is hidden because the U.S. justification for occupying the southern half is, they need to hide this stuff to justify the U.S. occupation of Korea to this day, because if the American public knew of this ugly history, then there would be more pressure for the U.S. to get out. Now, according to Bruce Cummings, when it came to the massacres perpetrated during the war, for every one massacre carried out by communist forces, 6 were carried out by the U.S. and South Korea. Now, when it comes to war, people often say there's atrocities on all sides. When it comes to 6 to 1, I think it's clear who is really the negative and really war criminal is in this conflict. And again, this is Bruce Cummings, who is recognized by the establishment of the establishment. He lectures for U.S. government even, and he's won awards from South Korea. He's recognized as a top American historian on Korea by the establishment even, and he has written about this and exposed this fact. So the propaganda, as often when it comes to these wars, is a complete reversal of reality. But for some reason, when it comes to this war, the Korean War, this is not known about. People know about U.S. atrocities in Vietnam a little bit. People know about U.S. atrocities in Iraq a little bit. They don't know the full scope of it, but they have a basic understanding that the U.S. was committing crimes in these countries. When it comes to Korea, where there is no shortage of atrocities by the U.S., it's not known about because, again, this is hidden because it's inconvenient for the imperialist narrative. Now, despite all of these atrocities carried out by the U.S. and its puppets in the South, it was a major defeat for the U.S. and a great victory for the DPRK and the Korean People's Army and the Korean people as a whole. And it was admitted that it was a defeat by the U.S. at the time. And again, this was admitted by the U.S. general who signed the armistice on July 27th, 1953. The U.S. had hoped that they would be able to overthrow the government in the North, but they were unsuccessful. Until this day, the DPRK still stands. And if we look at the North and the South, it's clear which government is the patriotic Korean government and which one is a foreign puppet. The North, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK, has no foreign troops occupying it, while the South, to this day, is occupied by the United States. This tells you which government is the patriotic, independent government and which one is a foreign puppet. So a lot of this information is probably surprising to many of you if you haven't studied this, and hopefully it gives a counter to a lot of the propaganda that people see with regard to the Korean War and with what's going on in Korea today. So please give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share this out with as many people as you can to get this message out, because more people need to learn about this history, especially in the United States. Again, this is so unknown. It's referred to as the Forgotten War in the United States, and to the extent that it's not forgotten, it's largely lied about. There is no justification to occupy the country. It should be left up to the Korean people to decide for themselves what government they'll have, and the US fueling this conflict, sending troops into South Korea, sending nuclear submarines, doing all these aggressive drills, which are really a threat to the North, because when these massive military war drills are going on, the North never knows whether this is a drill or not, if they're going to stop at the border, if they're going to continue. And after the war, there have been many examples of U.S. spy planes and helicopters and ships infringing on the territory of the DPRK. So the DPRK is right to be concerned about these aggressive maneuvers by the United States, especially considering all the other wars of aggression that the U.S. has carried out around the world. You know, Iraq, Syria, Libya, too many to count, really. The attempt to topple the socialist government in the North was a complete failure. The government of the DPRK is not going anywhere. You know, constantly since the 1990s, the U.S. media has been talking about any day now the North Korea is going to collapse, but it never happened. The Soviet Union's been gone for over 30 years now. The DPRK is still here, and that's because, in fact, despite all the propaganda at the time, the DPRK is not a puppet of any country. The DPRK is an independent government. And that is the true strength of the government and what gives it so much popularity with its people.